Hello, my name is Trey and welcome to Telos Bound. I'm sorry about how long it's been since the last video. I've been very busy with school and hockey these past few weeks, and unfortunately will likely have to decrease video production to about one per month until February of next year. In any case, we're back, and today I would like to talk about a very short book entitled The Agony of Eros by Byung-Chul Han. Han is, in my opinion, one of the most underappreciated philosophers alive today. This short book is packed with everything I like in a philosophical essay, and for that reason I decided to make a video on it, even though I've already talked about Han on this channel before. Okay, so let's begin. According to Han, everything in modern society is being thrown into the, quote, inferno of the same. Everything is brought into this horizontal and symmetrical regime, one which is based on positive differences, which are able to be encompassed by the ego and, by extension, modern consumerist capitalism. Everything becomes something like a homogeneous mass, where there are differences no doubt, but differences which do not challenge the framework at large on account of their lack of otherness. Otherness is negativity, i.e. that which simply cannot be accounted for within the regime of the ego, something that destroys symmetry, being unable to be captured in its negativity and turned into something consumable. Eros, according to Han, is based upon this sort of otherness. In true love, the subject gives itself over to the other and receives itself back as the gift of the other. In modern society, there is the erosion of the other, which in turn means there is the loss of Eros. Eros is based upon atopy, meaning placelessness/otherness or negativity. In true love, we cannot name why we love a particular person. We cannot pinpoint some positive reason, as this reason is beyond grasping or symbolization. This is, of course, something Zizek has been talking about for years. Atopy is differentiated by Han from heterotopy, which is based on positivity, something which is able to be accounted for within a certain framework, whether that be the ego or capitalism or whatever else, and therefore made subject to consumption. In modern society, we have the emergence of the narcissistic self, which is only receptive to heterotopy, but never confronts the atopic difference of the other. The narcissistic self is unable to clearly distinguish between itself and the other, let alone to come to terms with its otherness. It can only find meaning in that which it sees a reflection of itself, meaning true love becomes impossible and is replaced by narcissism. The modern narcissistic subject isn't able to give itself over to the other, to lose its own superficial control over itself and come to terms with the reality of its finitude. This finitude implies that beyond itself there is simply an ungraspable abyss, i.e. the other. But contrary to the fears of the narcissistic subject, the recognition of one's finitude by no means entails that one is barred from the other and trapped in some sort of prison. To quote Han, quote, Eros makes possible experience of the other's otherness, which leads the one out of a narcissistic inferno. It sets into motion freely willed self-renunciation, freely willed self-evacuation. A singular process of weakening lays hold of the subject of love, which, however, is accompanied by a feeling of strength. This feeling is not the achievement of the one, but the gift of the other. Unquote. This is true freedom and the basis of true joy, something understood intimately by the Christian religion as its highest goal is union with the ungraspable superessential Trinity as detailed in the writings of mystics such as Saints Dionysius the Areopagite and John of the Cross. Depression, which is the result of a lack of love, is the subject falling into its own abyss. This is exactly how C.S. Lewis describes hell in The Great Divorce, as it is something so small it doesn't even have room for an apple, precisely because it is the immaterial human soul which is turned away from God and into the darkness of its own abyss. Han will also connect this more philosophical stuff on love to modern social theory and politics. The achievement subject of neoliberalism, as he calls it, engages in auto-exploitation, which creates a false sense of liberty. This is the main thesis of his book Psychopolitics. The modern achievement subject does not love, but only narcissistically consumes and works, under the neoliberal option of you can, as opposed to the more traditional imperative of you should. Because the you can of neoliberalism has no explicit imperative from an other, it is oneself that becomes one's own master. Contrary to the naivety of modern liberalism, this isn't an increase in freedom. It only results in auto-exploitation. You either fall into burnout and lose any motivation to keep yourself accountable to your own self-created standards, or you become anxious and perpetually unsatisfied. This is because we know from psychoanalysis that we never get what we desire. We never feel satisfied with ourselves. And in this sense, the lack of authority in neoliberal society is bound to create depression, burnout, and anxiety. As the wise Sorn of the planet Mars says in Lewis's Out of Silent Planet concerning humans, quote, "There must be rule, yet how can creatures rule themselves? Beasts must be ruled by Hanau, and Hanau by Eldilla, and Eldilla by Melodil. These creatures have no Eldilla. They are like one trying to lift himself by his own hair, or one trying to see over a whole country when he is on a level with it, like a female trying to beget young on herself." Unquote. The point Lewis is making here, which Hahn makes as well, is that the idea of humanity being its own authority is simply illogical, as the very notion of any sort of imperative or rule implies a ruler and a ruled, or a creditor and a debtor. But in modern capitalism, we can never fully pay off our debts, as Hahn explains, quote, "Relief from debt, financial and psychological, and gratification both presume the other. Lack of a binding connection to the other is the transcendental condition for crises of gratification and debt. Such crises make it plain that capitalism, counter to widespread belief, is not a religion. Every religion operates with both debt and relief, but capitalism only works with debt and default. It offers no possibility for atonement, which would free the debtor from liability." Unquote. Thus, what is needed in modern neoliberal society is the return of the other, so that we can escape the inferno of the same. We must overcome our narcissism and recognize that failure is constitutive of life itself. What we are unable to do today is to be, quote, "not able to be able," as Hahn puts it. This inability to absolutize the other, or to fail to do so, is the foundation of Eros, because Eros presupposes something outside the regime of the ego or the inferno of the same. Furthermore, we must consider the other not merely to be an object, but a subject, a thou, not an it. It has become increasingly clear that the subject, within its transcendental awareness, we may call it, can accept the otherness of the it precisely because it's a pseudo-acceptance. We can easily recognize the Kantian gap between ourselves and the world of objects. But the other, as a personalized thou, actively resists being brought into the domain of the one. This means that it can engender the uniquely human experience of pride and narcissism, to which the only solution is humility. In our narcissism and pride, we have rejected the other because of its threat as a personalized thou which we cannot absolutize and bring under our control. The disappearance of the other is the agony of Eros. Hahn will also touch on sexuality in this book, putting forth very strong arguments against pornography and even the very basis of sexual liberation as it's understood by modern liberals. According to Hahn, love is now being replaced by sexuality and made into a commodity. To quote him, quote, "Today, love is being positivized into sexuality, and by the same token, subjected to commandment to perform. Sex means achievement and performance, and sexiness represents capital to be increased. The body, with its display of value, has become a commodity. At the same time, the other is being sexualized into an object for procuring arousal. When otherness is stripped from the other, one cannot love, one can only consume." Unquote. Hahn will then go on to talk about how in our society we are losing the traditional distance between the private and public spaces with social media and especially pornography. Obscenities, which never would have been considered socially acceptable just a decade ago, have now become commonplace in modern parlance. We no longer have manners, as the public space and the private space are increasingly entering into each other. Yet this is not the basis of liberation. It is simply throwing everything into the inferno of the same. As opposed to private intimacy, we now get public crowding. This invariably creates depression and anxiety. Furthermore, in throwing everything into this open and mundane public space, we're losing love. Love is now just simply pleasure for pleasure's sake, as you can see from this funny yet sadly not all that uncommon interaction on Tinder. There is no longer any story or narrative accompanying love and even life itself, which is the central thesis of Hans' The Scent of Time. There is no longer any narrative to infuse life with meaning. Now all we have is bare pleasure. Furthermore, sexuality is able to be commodified. To call a woman sexy, for example, is often akin to giving a description of a commodity we are considering buying. And just as we feel the need to enjoy the new updated version of our iPhone, we now feel an imperative to enjoy sex, as opposed to the traditional problem of sex addiction and the desire to be promiscuous. The new problem created by promiscuous sex and pornography is an inability to enjoy these things. Han will also talk about how love is no longer risky. It's been completely consumerized. Romanticism is now characterized by terms such as nice, sweet, and gentle. This is totally different from the violence of passion. This violence is represented in the Greek myth of Adonis, who is unintentionally killed by a boar which stabs him with its tusks in its attempt to caress him. There's no longer any negativity in love, no more surprises. We get casual sex, the phenomenon of the quickie. This is all to say that the desire for the other has been replaced by the comfort of the same. The comfort of the same characterizes bare life, which in turn characterizes Nietzsche's last man, who values life simply for its sake. The last man has no desire for the beyond, to risk it all, to pursue his freedom unto death. This unrisky bare life is supported by mundane work, which simply serves as the means of fulfilling our basic biological needs for the perpetuation of bare life. Han will contrast the subject of bare life to the Hegelian absolute spirit, which Han interprets as that spirit which recognizes the negativity of the other. It doesn't attempt to subsume it within itself, as all the previous phases of consciousness had in Hegel's phenomenology. Rather, it, quote, looks negativity in the face and tarries with it. Instead of subsuming the other and reducing it to itself like the narcissistic subject, it encloses negativity within itself. This occurs through love, which is the forgetting of oneself in the other. One dies in the other, and the return to self is the gift of the other. That is to say, absolute spirit first gives itself up to the other, and then returns to itself as the gift of this very same other. Absolute spirit cannot occur in the inferno of the same, which reduces the other to the one. In pornography, there isn't even an other to give oneself up to, which is why it intensifies the narcissism of the modern subject. As Han puts it, quote, porn is a matter of bare life on display, unquote. It destroys even the sexual, and is the polar opposite of the erotic. It is the ultimate example of extreme profanity, which is also, paradoxically, profound mundanity. This is the basis of Hans' critique of Agamben's notion of profanation, which is the rejection or ignoring of the sacrality of things which have been set apart by society. This occurs by subjecting these previously sacred objects to common usage. It involves a rejection of what Agamben considers to be the fundamentally theological view that certain things have a sacral nature, and therefore deserve to be kept at a distance and shown reverence. What Agamben doesn't take into account, however, is that there is a fundamental difference between religious setting aside or consecration and the setting aside we see in modernity. For example, both tourism and pilgrimage set aside certain places as more important or even sacred, but both differ insofar as in tourism we pass by instead of lingering. Tourism always profanes the object it superficially considers sacred. It treats it as an object to be consumed by the tourist's eyeballs. So just as Zizek critiques Judith Butler's philosophy of sexual liberation as simply describing what modern capitalism is already doing, Han says the same about Agamben's notion of profanation. And far from profanation creating the liberating environment for the erotic, it blends everything together in a bare and obscene display. Everything becomes pornography. Quote, capitalism is aggravating the pornographication of society by making everything a commodity and putting it on display. Knowing no other use for sexuality, it profanes Eros into porn. On this score, Agamben's profanation amounts to just so much profanity, unquote. Han points out that Bataille's eroticism was a holy eroticism, which included specific festivals and games which stood apart from another. When we destroy these sorts of rituals, we get the naked pornographic bareness which negates all eroticism. The bareness of modern life undermines all forms of experience which relies on negativity and otherness. For example, rage is increasingly replaced by mere annoyance, as rage is based on the same negativity as Eros itself. Just as in love we give ourselves over to the other, in rage we give ourselves over to anger. Dostoevsky's underground man is incapable of rage, as his consciousness is essentially an inferno of the same, which is able to subsume everything within itself, and therefore negate everything which relies on the organic and spontaneous, such as anger and love. To quote Dostoevsky, quote, "In consequence again of those accursed laws of consciousness, anger in me is subject to chemical disintegration. You look into it, the object flies off into air, your reasons evaporate, the criminal is not to be found, the wrong becomes not a wrong but a phantom, something like the toothache, for which no one is to blame, and consequently there is only the same outlet left again, that is, to beat the wall as hard as you can." Unquote. Love, just as anger, is based upon a negative atopic difference which cannot be subsumed by the ego. To use Alain Badiou's term, love is an event. It introduces negativity, something completely outside the coordinates of the previous order. The event allows something wholly other to emerge. The event connects love, politics, and art, infidelity, to the radical transformation which it brings about. Furthermore, philosophy and thought should be understood as eventful. Philosophy is not meant to merely represent the way things are, but to create new ways of thinking and experiencing. True thinking involves challenging the existing order in its hegemony. This desire to reach into the unknown characterizes philosophy. Philosophy and thinking isn't data-driven. It cannot be. Only calculation is data-driven. Thinking is driven by Eros, by the desire to reach the unknown and the love of its mystery. To quote what is now one of my favorite quotes of all time, "Philosophy is the translation of Eros into Logos." Thank you so much for watching this video. Please like and subscribe if you got any value out of it. Check the description for the sources I used and the timestamps which divide the sections of this video, and also for the ways to support my work financially. I will be starting a Patreon sometime early next year, but I currently don't have the time to create consistent, let alone extra content, so that will have to wait. Once again, thank you all for watching, and may God bless you all.